So welcome everyone. I am Ala Alameddin from the One Democratic State Initiative. This is hosted by the Palestine Dialogue Group in Istanbul, or Palestine Hiwar Group in Istanbul. And we are hosting Mr. Saul Takahashi. So let me make sure I have everything right about you, Saul. So you're Professor of Human Rights and Peace Studies at Osaka Jogakuin University. You have positions at Amnesty International, the UN Office on Drug and Crime. You were deputy head at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in occupied Palestine. And you're now working on a doctoral thesis on the rights of Muslims in Japan. You're also, so you worked for the human rights in Palestine. Am I correct?
Yes, that's right. That's correct.
Okay, great. So we'd love to hear about you. We know about the Palestinian efforts before the ICC regarding all the violations in Palestine. So we'd love to know more. Do you think this could lead to anything? What kind of contribution can this do to the cause? We're all ears.
Right. Okay. Alhamdulillah. Okay. Well, all right. So let me get started. Salam alaikum to everybody. And perhaps if I could just share my slides. Oh, I don't seem to have the right to share slides yet. If somebody could. Yes. Okay. Very good. Okay. Let me see. Just so everybody understands, this is just my background from Zoom. I'm not currently in Jerusalem, unfortunately. Inshallah, someday I will be. But this is right. Okay, so this is the one. Right. So as we have been doing for quite some years since Corona, let me just start with my slideshow here. Okay, great. So as I've already been, introduced right now, I'm teaching at Osaka Jogakuin University. It's a very small women's university in central Osaka in Japan. I'm a human rights lawyer by training. I started off my career at Amnesty International, and I was working with refugees there. I did all sorts of things. But I started off as a refugee lawyer at Amnesty International in Tokyo. And just as a funny coincidence, the first refugee applicant, the applicant for refugee status in Japan that we were able to get refugee status for was Palestinian, as fate would have it. At the time, I knew very little about Palestine, but he was from Kuwait originally. And of course, this was many years ago. And after the first Gulf War, of course, he had to flee. And of course, he couldn't go back. So there was nowhere they could send him to, even if they didn't give him status. He couldn't be expelled anywhere. So that was the main argument that we used to get him refugee status. And he got status. And as far as I know, he's still living in Japan. So alhamdulillah, that went well. In any case, I started off my career in Amnesty International and then moved on later on to the United Nations and did all sorts of different things. But from 2009 to 2014, I was the deputy head of office at the UN Human Rights Agency, the Office of the UN Human Rights Commissioner in occupied Palestine. I lived in Jerusalem, but our main office was in Ramallah. We had an office in Gaza, so I went there pretty frequently, and also offices all over the West Bank, mainly Hebron and East Jerusalem. So I did quite a lot of traveling for work all over the West Bank. So that was, those 5 years were a very monumental experience, of course, and that's really how I got into the whole issue of Palestinian rights and the whole issue of Palestine. I do research on Islamophobia and Muslim rights, especially in Europe, also Japan, but of course Palestine remains very close to my heart and dear to my heart, and I still do a lot of research on it. So one thing, of course, I did work for the UN. I worked for the UN for, I guess 15 years. And one of the things that you learn very quickly when you work for the United Nations, especially in Palestine, is that there are certain terms that you just cannot use and certain words that you are prohibited from using. And I used to call them sort of ABCJ. A for apartheid. This was a big, big no-no. It's getting to be less of a no-no, but the people who are, who have pointed out the clear as the light of day fact that what is going on is apartheid have been international human rights organizations and also UN special rapporteurs, human rights special rapporteurs, who are not part of the UN civil service as such. They're independent experts. As UN civil servants, as you will see, as you surely have noted, of course, using the A word is still a big, big no-no, a big, big boo-boo. B for boycott. I remember, just from my personal experience, when I was in Palestine, I remember there was a colleague from another, it wasn't even human rights, it was a different agency, and he got an invitation to a sort of seminar, not to be in the seminar or present in the seminar, but just an invitation to a seminar. You get these kind of invitations all the time. You're on these mailing lists and all that kind of stuff. And I think some of the panelists on this seminar were advocating for boycott of Israel. And he just sort of glanced at it and he forwarded it to some colleagues and some agencies, including myself. I just sort of glanced at it. I wasn't able to go, so I just dumped it. I mean, it was one of those kind of things. But then it was a big deal. The Israelis were watching us. They were watching us all the time, and somehow they got wind of this, and they used it to jump on this guy and jump on the agency that he was working for, saying that he was advocating a boycott of Israel by merely forwarding this email. So that was the extent to which one had to be careful. We were international civil servants. We always had to show that we were impartial, even if we weren't impartial in our hearts. A different colleague from a different agency he put it very well. He said, he put it like this. He said, we're all international civil servants and we have to act impartial and show that we're impartial in everything that we do. But if you come to Palestine and after 2 weeks, if you're still impartial in your heart, then there's something wrong with you. And I think that's really how the vast, overwhelming majority of UN civil servants felt. I wouldn't even say 2 weeks. I would say 1 week would be more accurate. But anyway, that was the extent to which we had to be careful of the boycott, of the B words, and all of these words. C for colonies or colonization. The colonization of the West Bank, Israeli settlements, all of these kind of things. These are the sort of accepted words: Israeli settlement, the settlement policy of Israel. It's never the colonization policy or colonization in just a general sense. There's just no way we were allowed to use those kind of words. And the J for Jewish settlement was another word. It being we always had to use the term Israeli settlement, not Jewish settlement, not Jewish colony, not Israeli colony. It had to be Israeli settlement. Just one of those things that we had to be ultra careful of. And it was never really, none of this is on paper. I mean, there were never any kind of serious rules in any kind of formal sense, but it was just understood and just understood within the civil service that these were things that we just had to avoid. Alhamdulillah, fortunately, I'm not with the UN anymore, so I can say what I want. And believe me, I will. I do, and I will. In fact, I used to when I was in Palestine. I'm not trying to sort of brag about this or anything, but I'm not trying to sort of pretend like I'm heroic. But I did speak my mind once, sort of to the wrong people, and this is what happened. This is still on the internet. You can search for it if you go to Jerusalem. If you search Jerusalem Post Saul Takahashi, you'll find it. So this is just to reassure everybody, this is where my heart lies. But one had to be careful, and this is a screenshot of something that happened to a colleague, again from a different agency. She was 48. She is 48 Palestinian, so she has Israeli papers. And she was working as a national staff in a different agency, and she sent out what was really a very innocuous tweet about. I'm not going to go into the details. I don't think we have time, but. A very sort of what I would say a harmless tweet, perhaps factually not 100% accurate, But that was hardly the point. I mean, that was the excuse, but it was something that, again, the sort of the right wing in Israel and the Israeli government jumped on, and they were, you open Google in Palestine, of course you have to go through these Israeli servers, and so this is what you get, like at the banner at the top of Google. And yeah, I mean, there was pressure put on her workplace and pressure put on her personally. It was very, very, very bad. So it was an extremely difficult situation. And when we were working in Palestine, it was, we were always very, very mindful of the fact that they were watching. I mean, they were always watching us, and any kind of sort of any do or say anything outside of sort of the accepted norms, and you would get in very, very serious trouble. That Jerusalem Post article got me in serious trouble. I mean, I would have had to leave, not the UN, but I certainly would have had to leave Palestine had it developed further. Fortunately for me, it did not, so I managed to stay. But it was, I thought it was nice. I mean, I wanted to frame it and put it on my wall, but my superiors were not so impressed, let's put it that way. But anyway, that's just to sort of introduce all of these things and introduce myself and the sort of constraints that a lot of UN people have, or the UN in general have, in Palestine. Now, I understand that most of the people here today are quite familiar with the situation in Palestine. So I don't think I'd really need to go into great details about that. But so I have a lot of slides about more sort of general slides about Palestine. I think we could just sort of skip those. And I understand that, you're all familiar with the two-state solution and one-state solution debate, if you like. So I don't think I really need to go into that either. I have these slides which basically argue against the two-state solution and point to it as the international injustice that it is, because certainly it comes from, it all started out, I mean, at least in a sort of legal or international policy sense, from the UN partition resolution. And of course, this is a huge injustice, a huge dropping of the ball on the part of the UN and the international community as a whole. And yet it still is there. I mean, this whole two-state solution is still the default go-to option for the international community. I have these, again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I understand that most people here are familiar with this whole thing and how this came about. But if you just look at, the map on the left, this is what Palestine looked like. 93% of the land was owned by Palestinians, 2/3 of the population. And yet the international community, so to speak, the UN sort of trots over and says, well, why don't you just, let's just split the country 50-50. You give half of your country over to these Europeans who are coming over to colonize your land and take over your land. That's a great solution. No, of course, it's not a great solution. Clear injustice, and it remains the default option for the international community. And then we have the Nakba. Of course, again, I understand that everybody's familiar with all of these things and what happened. The Zionists took over more than they had been allotted in the partition resolution. So 78% of Palestine was taken over. And and then they declared the state of Israel, and sort of this is the rest is history, so to speak. I mean, most of the borders, legally speaking, the borders of the state of Israel have not been are not clearly defined yet, and that's mainly because the Israelis want more and more, but it's not clearly defined. But more or less, it's fair to say that most countries of the world that have diplomatic relations with the state of Israel recognize this to be more or less what's going to be their borders. And certainly the UN, working for the United Nations, anything within the Green Line, so 48 Palestine, was completely off limits. I mean, it was just, we couldn't talk about it. We couldn't mention it in any of our human rights reports. It was just something which we could not touch at all. And unfortunately, that remains the case with the International Criminal Court, and we'll get to that later. So again, I think everybody here is perfectly familiar with this, so I won't spend too much time on this. One, of course, significant development that's been taking place over the past couple of years is that international human rights organizations and big, sort of very well-respected, well-known